She wore a fringed buckskin jacket, pulled tight against the cold of an Ohio spring night that she did not survive. The jacket was handmade, long and tawny, stitched with leather lacing and alive with fringe that fell from the sleeves and hem. It was the kind of garment a person would remember, the kind of garment that should have told a story. Yet for 37 years, no one could read it. The young woman found strangled and beaten on a lonely stretch of road outside Troy, Ohio, in April of 1981 carried no purse, no identification, no name that the living could speak. She became the Buckskin Girl, a title drawn from her clothing, a placeholder for a life that had been erased. And she remained a ghost in the files of the Miami County Sheriff's Office, her face reconstructed again and again by artists trying to pull a name out of silence, until a new kind of detective work reached into the microscopic architecture of her DNA and finally, gently, handed her back the name she was born with, Marcia Lenore King. Before we go further into this story, please consider subscribing to Cold Case Whisperer. It's much appreciated, and it helps us keep bringing you real cold case stories like this one. Marcia Lenore King came into the world on June 22, 1959, in Little Rock, Arkansas. Her childhood was not an easy one. Those who knew her would later describe a girl who endured hardship early, a girl who grew into a young woman with a restless spirit and a powerful need to find her own path, even if that path led away from the people who loved her. By the time she reached her late teens, she had already tasted a life far larger than the city limits of Little Rock. She dropped out of school. She gave birth to a daughter. And because the world was complicated and she was young, the child was placed for adoption. That loss, or that sacrifice, depending on how one views it, became part of the fabric of her short life. She drifted from her family, not with anger but with distance, the kind of distance that grows when a person is chasing something undefined and cannot find a way to circle back home. Her mother and sister held onto fragments of her, a phone call here, a postcard there, but she had become a traveler, wanderer, a face in the crowd at rodeos and truck stops, crossing state lines with nothing but the clothes on her back and the certainty that she belonged to the road. The last time anyone in her family heard her voice was sometime in late 1980. She called from somewhere in the South, perhaps Kentucky, perhaps passing through on her way to another place that promised something she could not name. She sounded all right. She did not say she was in trouble, and because she was a grown woman who had always come and gone as she pleased, no one filed a missing person report when the call stopped. Her family assumed, as families often do in such circumstances, that she had simply moved on again, that she was out there living her life on her own terms, and that one day the phone would ring and she would be on the other end, her voice carrying the sound of the next town, the next adventure. That call never came. On the morning of April 22, 1981, a motorist traveling along Greenlee Road, a narrow rural artery cutting through Miami County, Ohio, noticed something lying in the drainage ditch alongside the pavement. At first glance, it might have been a discarded heap of clothing or a deer struck by a vehicle, but as the driver drew closer, the shape resolved into something unmistakable and terrible. A young woman lay on her back, fully dressed, her brown hair tangled, her face swollen and bruised. She had been dead for perhaps 36 to 48 hours. The driver found a phone and summoned the authorities, and within the hour, the quiet farmland near the small city of Troy became the center of a homicide investigation that would stretch across generations. Deputies from the Miami County Sheriff's Office arrived and secured the scene. The coroner's investigator knelt beside the body and began the grim inventory that would form the foundation of the case file. The woman was white, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, around 125 pounds, with brown hair and hazel eyes. She had suffered blunt force trauma to her face and head. the kind of beating that speaks of prolonged violence and rage. A ligature had been tightened around her neck with sufficient force to end her life. The medical examiner would later rule strangulation as the immediate cause of death. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, a silent testimony that she had fought her attacker. She had not been sexually assaulted. The absence of any identification, wallet, or personal papers suggested that whoever killed her had stripped away those connections deliberately, or that she had been traveling without them, her identity already reduced to whatever she carried in her memory. What she did carry, what she wore, would become the signature that haunted the public and the police alike. Her outer garment was a full-length buckskin jacket, almost a poncho, made of soft-tanned leather and covered in long fringe. It laced up the front like something from another century, part pioneer, part Native American craftwork, entirely unique. Underneath, she had on a simple red turtleneck, blue jeans, and a pair of handmade deerskin moccasins. On one finger was a silver ring set with a turquoise stone. The jacket bore a decorative patch, and when investigators examined it closely, they realized it was a souvenir patch from the 1979 National High School Rodeo Finals. That patch became the first and most tantalizing clue. Detectives contacted the Rodeo Association, hoping that someone would remember a dark-haired young woman in a fringed buckskin coat. The association had no such record. The patch, they learned, had been widely distributed. Thousands of attendees had purchased them, traded them, sewn them onto hats and vests and jackets. It was a dead end dressed up as a lead. The press quickly picked up on the striking imagery. Reporters dubbed her the Buckskin Girl, and the name stuck with the tenacity of frost on a window pane. Photographs of the jacket and the patch were circulated to every law enforcement agency in the country. The victim's fingerprints were taken and compared against every known database of the time. Dental records were charted and shared. Missing person bulletins from all 50 states were combed for a young woman matching her description. Nothing came back. She was a phantom, a cipher, a girl who had walked into death without leaving a paper trail behind her. The autopsy added a few more details to the portrait. A small horizontal scar across her lower abdomen indicated that she had undergone a cesarean section or some other abdominal surgery, confirming that she had given birth at some point in her short life. That fact humanized her further, transformed her from a nameless victim into someone's mother, someone who had brought a child into the world and then, by whatever turn of fate, had ended up alone in a ditch in Ohio. Detectives wondered about that child, about whether somewhere there was a little boy or girl who would grow up never knowing what had happened to their birth mother. But there was no way to trace that thread without a name. The years passed. The Buckskin Girl was buried in Riverside Cemetery in Troy under a modest headstone that said only those two words, a nickname that had become her epitaph. The grave was maintained by the community, people who felt a kinship with the stranger, who brought flowers and said prayers for a woman they had never met. Meanwhile, the investigative file sat in the Miami County Sheriff's Office, periodically pulled from the shelf by a new detective determined to succeed where others had failed. Every few years, a fresh effort was launched. In 2001, with the advent of more sophisticated DNA technology, her body was exhumed. A sample of bone and tissue was collected, and a full genetic profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, the national database that holds DNA from convicted offenders and from unidentified remains. The hope was that a familial match or a direct hit would link her to a missing person case somewhere in the country. That hope went unfulfilled. CODIS returned no matches. The Buckskin Girl remained anonymous. Forensic science continued to evolve. Isotope analysis, a technique that measures the chemical signatures locked in hair, teeth, and bone to determine where a person lived during different periods of their life, was performed on her remains. The results suggested that she had spent much of her later childhood and adolescence in the southwestern United States, perhaps Texas, Oklahoma, or the very state where she was born, Arkansas. She had moved around considerably in the months before her death, a finding consistent with the transient lifestyle. The analysis reinforced a rodeo connection and the notion that she had been a drifter, someone who slipped through the cracks of stable society. In 2016, the sheriff's office released a new forensic facial reconstruction, a digital bust crafted by a skilled artist that showed a fresh-faced young woman with high cheekbones, a gentle mouth, and clear eyes that seemed to look directly at the viewer with an expression of faint expectation. The image was shared on social media and in news reports, generating hundreds of tips. None of them led to her identity. By early 2017, the case had consumed 36 years and had become one of the most persistent mysteries in Ohio. And then, quietly, something shifted. A nonprofit organization called the DNA Doe Project, founded by a small group of dedicated genetic genealogists, reached out to the Miami County authorities with an audacious proposition. They wanted to take a sample of the Buckskin Girl's DNA and apply a method that was, at the time, almost unheard of in cold case work. They would have the DNA sequenced in a way that produced a file compatible with public genealogy databases like GeneMatch, a platform where amateur genealogists and curious individuals upload their own raw DNA data to find distant relatives. Then, using the same techniques that adoptees and family historians use to build sprawling family trees, they would trace the Buckskin Girl's ancestry backward through time, identifying the common ancestors who linked her to living people, and gradually, painstakingly, narrowing the search until they landed on a name. It was a method that had never been used to identify a long unidentified murder victim, and it required not only scientific precision, but also an almost monastic patience. The sheriff's office agreed. Fundraising began to cover the cost of the sequencing and the genealogical work, and donations trickled in from strangers who had never forgotten the young woman in the buckskin jacket. A sample of her DNA was sent to a laboratory, and the resulting data file was uploaded to GeneMatch. The search began in earnest in late 2017, and it was slow, grinding work. The initial matches were distant, mere whispers of shared DNA, pointing to fourth and fifth cousins scattered across the United States. The genealogists, volunteers working late into the night on their home computers, began the process of building enormous family trees, tracking each match backward to a set of common ancestors and then forward again to identify living descendants. They work with names and dates from census records, obituaries, marriage licenses, and anything else that could help them connect the invisible dots. The team knew that they were racing against time, not because the case had a deadline, but because each day that passed without a name was another day that a family somewhere lived with an unanswered question they did not even know they had. As the volunteers at the DNA Doe Project closed in on a particular branch of a sprawling family tree, tracing the descendants of a couple who had lived in the South in the early 20th century, they were about to do what decades of conventional detective work could not: give a name to a woman who had been anonymous for so long. If you are finding this story compelling, I want to take a brief moment and invite you to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these important and deeply human cases to light, stories that honor the victims and the tireless work of those who refuse to let them be forgotten. The breakthrough came in the early months of 2018. The genealogists had isolated a cluster of DNA matches that all pointed toward one particular family line rooted in Arkansas. Working methodically, they identified a couple whose children and grandchildren fit the age and location patterns that the isotope analysis had suggested. One of those children was a daughter born in 1959, a girl whose paper trail went cold around the year 1980. Her name was Marcia Lenore King. The team contacted the Miami County Sheriff's Office with their findings and urged detectives to reach out to potential relatives. A call was placed to a woman in Arkansas who turned out to be Marcia's sister. The detective explained why he was calling, and there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Marcia had not been seen or heard from since late 1980, but no missing person report had ever been filed. The family had simply assumed that she was out there living her life, that her silence was a choice, not an ending. The sister and Marcia's mother, who was still alive at the time but in declining health, provided DNA samples for comparison. The test was conclusive. The Buckskin Girl was Marcia Lenore King. On April 11, 2018, the Miami County Sheriff held a press conference in Troy, Ohio, and announced the identification to the world. In front of a bank of cameras, with the forensic reconstruction of Marcia's face displayed on a screen behind him, the sheriff spoke the name that had been missing from the case file for 37 years. He described the work of the DNA Doe Project and the volunteers who had spent countless hours building family trees from the faintest strands of genetic data. He expressed the hope that Marcia's family could now find some measure of closure, even as the investigation into her murder remained open and urgent. The announcement rippled through the true crime community and beyond, a moment of profound significance for forensic science and for everyone who had ever looked at that jacket and wondered who she was. The aftermath of the identification brought with it a flood of emotion and memory. Marcia's family, though devastated by the circumstances of her death, finally had an answer to the question that had lingered unspoken for nearly 4 decades. They had always wondered what had become of her. They had prayed that she was safe, that she had built a life somewhere, and now they knew that she had met a violent end on a dark road far from the Arkansas soil where she was born. Her mother passed away not long after the identification, but she died knowing her daughter's fate, which, for the family, was a mercy interwoven with grief. Marcia's daughter, the child she had placed for adoption, was located and informed. She had grown up without knowledge of her birth mother's identity and now had to process the dual revelation that she had been given up by a woman whose life was stolen in an act of savage cruelty. A new headstone was placed at Riverside Cemetery, this one bearing her full name, Marcia Lenore King, along with her dates of birth and death. The old marker, the one that read simply Buckskin Girl, was kept as a reminder of how long she had waited. A memorial service was held, and people from the community who had tended her grave for years came to pay their respects to a woman they had never met, but had come to love a way that is unique to those who befriend the dead. There was a sense of resolution, but also a deep and abiding sorrow, because even with her name restored, the most important mystery remained unsolved. The person who had beaten and strangled Marcia King, who had left her on Greenlee Road like something discarded, had never been identified, had never been called to account. The investigation into Marcia's murder remains active. Detectives with the Miami County Sheriff's Office have continued to pursue leads, some generated by the publicity surrounding the identification. The passage of time is the enemy of justice. Witnesses age, memories fade, and physical evidence degrades. Yet the identification itself offered a new starting point. Knowing who Marcia was means knowing, at least in outline, the road she traveled and the people she might have encountered. She was known to hitchhike, to move through rodeo circuits, to pass through truck stops and transient camps across the South and Midwest. These are not easy places to reconstruct the movements of a single individual, but every fragment of information sharpens the picture. The killer's DNA may exist on evidence preserved from the original crime scene, and the same genetic genealogy techniques that identified Marcia could, in theory, identify her murderer if a usable sample can be obtained and matched to a family tree. That work is ongoing, and it carries with it a quiet but stubborn hope. Marcia Lenore King was more than her death, more than the jacket that became her unfortunate emblem. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother. She was a young woman who, by all accounts, carried within her a fierce independence and a longing for a life that was free and unconstrained. She made mistakes. She drifted. She lost touch with the people who loved her, and yet she mattered. The fact that her family did not report her missing is not an indictment of them. It is a reflection of the complicated reality of estrangement and the way that silence can stretch into years without anyone realizing that it has become permanent. There are thousands of unidentified persons in this country, and many of them are people like Marcia, people who slipped through the cracks of record-keeping, whose disappearances were never formally recorded because those left behind believed, or needed to believe, that they were still out there. The science that gave Marcia back her name has already changed the landscape of cold case investigation. Genetic genealogy, once the province of hobbyists tracing their roots to distant ancestors, has become a tool of profound power in the pursuit of justice and the restoration of identity. The volunteers of the DNA Doe Project, working without fanfare and often without pay, have continued to solve case after case, giving names to the forgotten dead. Their work is a testament to the idea that no life is too small or too lost to be remembered, that the truth endures in the very code of our cells, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. The road where Marcia was found is quiet now. Greenlee Road still cuts through Miami County farmland, bordered by fields that cycle through seasons of planting and harvest, indifferent to the violence that occurred there one spring night decades ago. The ditch where she lay has been mowed and graded 100 times, yet the memory of what happened there persists, held by the officers who worked the case, by the family who grieves her, and by a community that came to see her as one of their own. Her story is a reminder that every unidentified victim is a person with a name, a history, and people who were meant to notice when they vanished. It is a reminder that the work of solving these cases is not just about catching killers, though that is vital. It is also about restoring dignity, about saying a name out loud after decades of silence. Marcia Lenore King is no longer the Buckskin Girl. She has her name carved into granite, spoken in prayers, recorded in the annals of solved mysteries. But the story does not yet have its final page. Somewhere, the person who took her life remains unpunished, walking free under the same sun that shines on her grave. The work continues. Detectives still follow leads. The same science that identified Marcia may yet turn its unblinking eye toward the one who killed her. And on that day, if that day comes, the circle will close in a way that the living who loved her have prayed for since that April morning in 1981, when a motorist stopped his car beside a ditch and saw a girl in a buckskin jacket who had been robbed of everything except the truth waiting in her bones. The identification of Marcia Lenore King did not merely solve a mystery. It altered the emotional landscape of an entire community. In Troy, Ohio, a small city of around 25,000 people, the Buckskin Girl had been a presence for so long that she had become woven into the local identity. For nearly 4 decades, residents had placed flowers on her grave, had attended vigils, had kept her photograph taped to the walls of police stations and posted on community bulletin boards. She was a stranger, yet she belonged to them in a way that is difficult to articulate unless one has lived in a place where an unsolved murder settles into the collective consciousness and refuses to leave. When the sheriff announced her name in that press conference, the response was not simply relief or satisfaction. It was a deep, communal exhale, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The city had carried her, and now she had been returned, not to life, but to her own story. The physical symbol of that transformation can be found at Riverside Cemetery, on a gentle slope not far from the Great Miami River. The original headstone, the one that read only Buckskin Girl, was not removed. It remains in place, a weathered monument to the years of anonymity, a reminder of how long justice can be delayed. Beside it now stands a new marker, polished granite, inscribed with her true name, Marcia Lenore King, along with the dates that bookend her short life, June 22nd, 1959, and April 22nd, 1981. Locals still visit the grave. Some leave flowers, others leave small tokens. A turquoise bracelet here, a feather there. Items that echo the aesthetic of the jacket that gave her a name before she had her own. The cemetery staff have noted that the grave is one of the most visited in the entire grounds, a destination for those who followed the case from afar and make the pilgrimage to pay their respects to a woman they never knew. The family of Marcia King has had to navigate a current of emotions that is both profound and deeply complicated. For a sister, the confirmation of Marcia's death brought an end to decades of suspended wondering. In the years following the identification, she has spoken publicly, though sparingly, about the guilt that accompanied the relief. No missing person report had been filed because Marcia was an adult, because she had drifted before, because the family believed she would eventually come home. That belief, so natural and so human, became a source of private anguish once the truth was known. The family had to reconcile the fact that while they were living their lives, Marcia was lying in a ditch and then in an unmarked grave, her identity just out of reach. Her mother, who was alive at the time of the identification but in the late stages of her own life, received the news with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow that words cannot fully capture. She passed away not long after, knowing at last what had become of her daughter. For the family, that knowledge was a gift, but it was a gift wrapped in pain. Marcia's daughter, the child placed for adoption, was also located. She had grown up unaware of her birth mother's name or fate. The revelation upended her own sense of identity, introducing a biological connection to a woman whose life ended in violence and mystery. The family has asked for privacy, and the public has largely respected that request, but the emotional weight they carry is a permanent part of the case's legacy. Meanwhile, the investigation into Marcia's murder has continued with a renewed sense of purpose. The Miami County Sheriff's Office has maintained an open file on the case, and detectives have pursued every lead generated by the massive publicity surrounding the identification. The core challenge remains the passage of time. 43 years have now elapsed since that April morning. The landscape of Greenlee Road has changed. Farms have been sold, trees have grown and been cut down, and the physical environment holds fewer secrets than it once did. Witnesses who might have seen something critical in 1981 are now elderly or deceased. The transient world that Marcia inhabited, the rodeo circuits and truck stops and highways, was never easy to map, and the trail has gone cold, not because of indifference, but because of the simple, relentless erosion of memory and evidence. Yet the same technology that restored Marcia's name has injected a new kind of hope into the search for her killer. The DNA Doe Project success demonstrated that genetic genealogy can solve the most stubborn of mysteries, and law enforcement agencies across the country took note. In the case of Marcia King, investigators have not publicly confirmed the existence of a full DNA profile belonging to her murderer, but they have indicated that biological evidence from the crime scene has been preserved. The ligature, the clothing, the trace materials collected during the original processing of the body, all have been stored for decades in the hope that science would one day catch up. That day has arrived. If a usable sample of the killer's DNA can be isolated, the same process that identified Marcia could be deployed to identify the person who took her life. The genealogists would build a family tree backward from whatever distant cousins appear in the database, just as they did for Marcia, and they would search for a person who was in the right place at the right time, with a connection to the victim that might be revealed only by the genetic code. The Miami County Sheriff has publicly stated that the case is not cold, that it remains an active homicide investigation, and that the department is committed to using every available forensic tool to find the person responsible. Whether a prosecutable case can be built after so many years depends on factors that the public may never fully know, but the will to pursue it is unquestionably present. The broader community of Miami County has responded to the identification and the ongoing investigation with the quiet steadfastness. The case has been taught in local schools as an example of how science and determination can intersect, and it has been discussed in civic groups and churches as a cautionary tale about the fragility of human connection. The volunteers who spent years tending Marcia's grave have been recognized for their compassion, and some of them have become advocates for other unidentified persons' cases, channeling the emotional energy of the Buckskin Girl story into a wider mission. The DNA Doe Project itself, born from the vision of Margaret Press and Colleen Fitzpatrick, has gone on to identify dozens of other John and Jane Does, and the organization frequently cites the Marcia King case as the one that proved the concept, the case that showed the world what citizen scientists working with law enforcement could achieve. Their work has inspired a movement, and that movement traces its lineage directly to a young woman in a fringed leather jacket found on a rural Ohio road. The lingering question of who killed Marcia King remains a wound that has not healed until an arrest is made, until a courtroom hears the evidence and the jury delivers a verdict. The story is unfinished. But the story is also a testament to the refusal to forget. The Miami County Sheriff's Office still fields tips. Detectives still travel to interview persons of interest. The file still sits on a desk, not in a storage box. The hope is that someone somewhere holds the missing piece. Perhaps it is a former truck driver who gave a ride to a young woman in buckskin and saw something he did not understand at the time. Perhaps it is a relative of the killer who begins to piece together fragments of memory and suspicion. Perhaps it is a laboratory technician who will one day extract a clear genetic profile from a piece of evidence that has waited silently in an evidence locker since 1981. Troy, Ohio, has changed in the 43 years since Marcia was found. It has grown, modernized, become a different version of itself. But the memory of the young woman found by the roadside has not faded. She is part of the town's history now, a permanent figure in its collective memory, standing at the intersection of tragedy and hope. Her grave will continue to receive visitors, her name will continue to be spoken, and her case will continue to be worked. For her family, the identification was a gift of immense magnitude, but it was not an ending. An ending requires accountability, and accountability requires the truth of what happened on that dark stretch of road. Until that truth is fully known, Marcia Lenore King remains both found and lost, a woman whose name has been restored but whose story is still being written, one page at a time, by those who refuse to let her be forgotten. Before you go, if you found value in this story, please consider hitting subscribe and leaving a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next real cold case investigation. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.